here's a look at the socks we're going to be crocheting today. Now this is going to be a Tunisian crochet project, and you can make this in any size you want. So these are Dylan's socks. She's 9 years old, and then these are mine. So, you know, you can make them in any size, provided that you have a few measurements.
The first measurement is the foot length, so measure from the tip of your big toe to the widest part of your foot. Next, you'll need your foot width, which is the circumference around the widest part of your foot.
Anyway, let's talk about the construction of this sock real quick. So just the terminology I'm going to be using throughout this tutorial. This is going to refer to the body of the sock. We got the toe, heel, cuff. There is more to the anatomy of a sock than just that, but for the purposes of this pattern, you don't need it. All you need to know, body, toe, heel, cuff. That's it. The way we're going to be constructing these pieces, we're going to begin with the body of the sock. And our initial chain is going to be the width of our, this section of the pattern. And then we're going to add length by adding the rows. So there you go. Next, we're going to add the toe. This is going to be done in 2 sections, and they're going to be worked exactly the same. You're going to cast on here along the bottom, and as you crochet rows, you're going to decrease every other row. We're going to turn it around, do the same thing, and at the end, you're going to stitch it. Now, if you are not a fan of the pointy toes, you can fix that when you stitch it closed. So you can make them more round if you want to, but I thought it looked kind of cool and kind of funny, so I left it. The heel is just a little bit different than the toe. We are still going to cast on along the bottom side like this. We're going to work several rows of decreases. Once we get to the end, we're going to form an hourglass shape essentially. But once we get to the narrowest part, we're going to start crocheting rows in increases to make it wide again. And then we're going to stitch along here, along the side. At the end, we're going to add the cuff. Now the cuff is going to be worked as a chain, and then we're going to add rows, which we attach as we crochet along the edge of our fabric. Something to note about Tunisian crochet is that it is not very stretchy. So, you know, keep that in mind. They're not going to be like knit socks that are super stretchy and can be made a little bit smaller. These will need to be a little bit bigger. As for the materials you'll need, I'll put a full list here on the screen in just a moment, but really it's just 2 different color yarns. This is a size 3 yarn or a lightweight yarn, a DK if you call it that as well. You can use sock yarn, you can use a sports yarn if you want, which is a size 2. Just play around with it. You might have to adjust your hook size, but you know, you can play around with it and make it your own. You'll need a Tunisian crochet hook, and I left my stitches here cast on so you can see, because folks do tend to ask if they can use a regular crochet hook. You can, provided that you can fit this many stitches on your hook. So if you have a traditional hook like the aluminum ones that have the big old flat thing here in the center, like the handhold, it will make it a little more difficult to cast on these stitches, and you'll have kind of a bump here in the center of your sock. So I highly recommend a Tunisian crochet hook. No, it does not need to be double-sided. We're not going to use a double-sided hook at all. This is just the only hook I had in this particular size. This is a 3.75 millimeter hook. You can use a 3.5 or you can use a 4 millimeter if you prefer. This is measurement based, so I'm not going to give you any stitch counts for any particular size, so you can adjust it as needed in order for the sock to fit you and to accommodate your hook and yarn combination. But yeah, so if you can fit this many stitches on a regular crochet hook, then, you know, go ahead. So we're going to begin with a chain. Now, if you can't do this part on your own, then this tutorial might be a little too advanced for you. So our chain is going to measure the measurement we took from the toe to the widest part of your foot. For me, that was 5 inches, which turned out to be 30 stitches. It might be different for you. Remember, we might be using a different hook and yarn combination, so just make sure you double check your measurements, count your stitches as you go, and jot them down so that you can make 2 matching socks. Now, something that I wanted to show you is the compression rate, or I guess compression differential, I'm not sure what to call it, that goes with Tunisian crochet. I cast on 30 chains when I crocheted this sock. This is also 30 stitches, 30 chains, and I'm leaving it so that it's not taut. And you can see that there is a length difference. That is because once you start crocheting all of these rows, you're going to get compression on your finished fabric compared to your initial chain. This is totally normal. It's totally fine. That's why this is measurement based and not stitch based. So make sure you jot down your stitch count. So, you know, you can have 2 matching socks. Anyway, so here you go. You start with your initial chain. We're going to cast on a foundation row. Now this one's pretty simple. It's just insert your hook into the first stitch, so the one right after, or the second stitch, I guess, of your chain. And then you just cast on, lifting up 1 loop for every stitch of the chain. Once all your stitches are cast on, we're going to work a return pass. Now this is going to be the same return pass that you're going to do throughout the entire body of this sock. So it doesn't matter what you start casting on, the return pass is exactly the same. This is just a regular Tunisian return pass. And the first thing is yarn over, pull through 1. Now for the rest of the loops on your hook, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So 1, 2, yarn over, pull through 1, 2, yarn over, pull through 1, 2, and we'll do another one together. So yarn over, pull through 1 and 2. Continue this until you get to the end of your row and you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. All right, so this is our foundation row. It's all cast on. This pattern, at least to create the honeycomb stitch, is a 2-row repeat. So for row number 1, let me get a little more yarn. You're always going to begin on the second vertical stitch of your row. So never on this one, always on this one. We're going to cast on a Tunisian simple stitch. So just insert your hook behind the top leg of your stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. In the next one, we're going to work a purl stitch. So you're going to reverse yarn over, pulling your yarn in front of your hook, hold this down, Tunisian simple stitch into the stitch. So insert your hook behind the top leg of the stitch. Now you're going to release this loop, pull it under your hook and then behind it, and just do a regular yarn over. And that's a purl. We're going to Tunisian simple stitch, and then you're going to purl again. So reverse yarn over, insert your hook behind the top leg of the stitch, pull your loop, or not your loop, your yarn like this under your hook and then behind it, and do a regular yarn over. So I've reached the last 2 vertical stitches of my row. Now this might be a little bit different for you depending on how many stitches you cast on initially. So my chain was 30 stitches, so I'm ending in a purl stitch. If you cast on 31 stitches, this might be a little bit different. You're going to end up on the Tunisian simple stitch. So, you know, just finish the row in following the sequence that you had already started for the rest of the row. All right, so I'm going to purl. And then you're going to cast on into the final stitch of the row. So you'll see this on the written pattern for those of you that are using it. This right here is the final stitch of the row. So you have this chain, it's going to be the one at the very end right here. I cast on by just grabbing the, inserting the hook behind the 2 loops right here on the side. And then just pull up a loop. All right, once you're all cast on, this is what it looks like. And you just work your return pass. So yarn over, pull through 1. And for the rest of the row, it's yarn over, pull through 2 until I'm left with just the 1 loop on my hook. All right, so here's row number 1. Now for row number 2, we're going to begin with the opposite stitch. So the first stitch we did in row 1 was a Tunisian simple stitch. And then we follow that up with a purl stitch. As you can see, the purl stitch creates a little bit of a knot here at the bottom, so you'll be able to identify them from row to row. So for row number 2, we're going to begin with a purl stitch. So we're going to do the opposite of what we did in the previous row. And then we're going to Tunisian simple stitch into the purl. So purl stitch, Tunisian simple stitch. So notice that I'm just grabbing the front leg of the stitch. And purl and simple stitch. And that's it. That's our 2-row repeat. So you're going to continue the same 2-row repeat. So once I'm finished with this, I'm going to do a repeat of row 1, then row 2, row 1, until you create the length for your fabric. Now, the length that you're going to need depends on the measurement that you took. So this is going to be the measurement you took for the widest part of your foot, which is up here. For me, that was about 9 inches. So I crocheted 46 rows in total. That includes my foundation row and my bind off. So for my repeats for this, it was 44 stitches. So my foundation row was just the foundation. We just worked row 1. This is row 2. So I did 44 and then I did the bind off. So that gave me my total row count of 46. You can count your rows however you prefer. Just make sure that you write that down in your notes as you're crocheting along so that you make 2 matching socks, because 2 rows will add a significant amount of length to your sock. So the socks are going to fit different. So do make sure that you write down very specifically whether or not you're including your foundation row and your bind off as part of your row count. All right, so I'm going to continue with this until I create the length I need, and then I'll show you how to do the bind off, and we'll stitch along and continue with the rest of the pattern. So once you reach the length you wanted for your sock, we have to do a bind off. Now make sure that you count the number of rows that you completed so you can complete the same number of rows for your second sock. For the bind off, we're going to use a combination of Tunisian simple stitch and a purl stitch mixed with a single crochet. So you're going to do the same sequence that you had done for the honeycomb stitch. So we're going to begin here with a purl. You can see this next stitch is a purl. So our Tunisian simple stitch, we're going to purl it. There we go. And we're going to close the stitch with a single crochet. And by that, you're just going to yarn over and pull through both of these loops on your hook. Now we're going to simple stitch into this purl. And we close as a single crochet. So you repeat this in all of the stitches of the row. On this final stitch, you're just going to single crochet. And just to keep our thread from coming out of our stitch, I guess, we're going to chain 1. And you're going to cut a nice long tail. We're going to use this to sew our sock closed. And there we go. We're going to have to weave in this end, but I have a knot here I couldn't get rid of. So I'm going to cut that here in a second. So weave in this short end, and then I'll show you how to stitch this long end so that you have a fairly invisible seam, which is going to go on the bottom part of the sock. All right, so for this next part, we're just going to join the 2 narrow ends of our fabric together to close out our sock, I guess. I'm not sure what the best way to express that is. All right, we're going to keep the honeycomb stitch on the outside, and the return pass is going to be the inside of our sock. So I just stitch right into this first corner. And I'm not using any particular type of invisible stitch or anything. I like the way the seam looks at the bottom. If you'd like to explore invisible seams, you can always watch a few knitting videos or, some other crocheters that might use that. What I'm doing is I'm just lining up my fabric and trying to line up the ends of my stitches together. And I'm really just going across. So I'm just going to go across this way and through here. And then in the next stitch, I'm going to go down. And this one I go up. And that's it. That is all I'm doing to stitch this together. You're going to continue this until you get to the other end right here. Make sure you double knot and weave in your tail end. So here's what our sock looks like once you've already closed out the 2 narrow edges together. We have a nice little tube here. All right, so if you counted the number of rows you completed, you're just going to divide that number by 2 or in half. So I crocheted 46 rows. That does include my foundation row and my bind off. So I'm going to need each side to have 23 stitches. And this is just so that we have an even toe. So I'm going to the seam here and counting 11 stitches. So I know that's not exactly 20, like half of 23, but it's as close as we're going to get. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And we're going to place a stitch marker on there. And we're going to do the same on this other side. So once you divided your stitching in half like this, make sure you count all of the stitching along the back side and then the front side and adjust your stitch markers as needed. So if it wasn't 23 that you needed across, you need maybe 24 or whatever it is, adjust it so that you have the same number of stitches along the back side of the fabric and the front side of the fabric. So this is going to be the bottom part of the sock, and this is going to be the top part. Now for this next part, we're going to work on the toe, and we're going to form that by making a bit of a trapezoid figure. So we're going to be decreasing every other row. We're going to do the same thing in the front panel, or what is it, the top part of the sock, as we are on the bottom part of the sock. So you'll have two pieces that you then have to stitch together. So you can switch color yarn at this point, or if you want to make them the same color, that's fine too. We're going to cast on into the stitch marker. So this is going to be your first stitch, and this is going to be your last stitch of the row. When you cast on this back side, you're going to do the same. You're going to cast on into, or your first stitch will be this stitch marker, and your last stitch will be this one. Yep. So you're just going to cast on a regular foundation row. Leave a nice tail end of yarn. You can weave that in later. I just slip stitch this to make sure it doesn't run as I'm crocheting. You don't have to, that's totally optional. But all right, so we go into the next available stitch and just yarn over and pull up a loop. So we repeat this in all of the stitches along the top part of the sock until you get to the other stitch marker. And we cast on into this final stitch. And now we work a regular return pass. So you're going to yarn over, pull through one. Now for all the rest of the stitches in the row, you just yarn over and pull through two until you are left with one loop on your hook. Now for the toe part as well as the heel, this foundation row is going to count as part of our row count. So this will count as row 1. We'll still call it a foundation row, but it does go into our every other stitch row count for the decreases. So I'll explain a little bit more what that means here in just a second, but I'll finish this return pass and then we'll come back. All right, so if you did the slip stitch like I did, you're gonna have these two loops on your hook at the end of the row. I just yarn over and pull through all three of these loops at the very end. There we go. All right, so for our next row, we're gonna crochet a decrease. Now the decreases, I work 2 knit stitches together. So the toe section, which I probably should have mentioned, is just gonna be knit stitch. So this was all our honeycomb stitching. We're just gonna work specifically with knit stitch for the toe and the heel of our sock. So we're gonna insert our hook behind the front leg of the second vertical stitch. So we're always gonna skip this first one. Go behind the first leg of the first vertical stitch, or I'm sorry, this is the second one. And now we're gonna go into the third one, and we're gonna go between both of the legs of the stitch through the back, yarn over, and pull up a loop by going through both of those stitches. So now we have 2 loops on our hook. Now for the rest of the row, until we get to these last 3 stitches, we're going to knit stitch 1 into every one of the vertical stitches. So just for a regular knit stitch, let's grab our yarn. I'm all tangled. Okay, we're going to go into the next one. So here are the 2 legs of the stitch. We're just going to insert our hook between both of the legs of the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And then we repeat. Now that we're down to these last 3 vertical stitches of the row, we're going to knit stitch these 2 together and then just cast on into the final stitch of the row. So again, you just insert your hook behind the front leg of the first vertical stitch, go into the second one and knit stitch. Then you're going to yarn over and pull through both of those. And then just cast on here into this final stitch. So that was a row of decreases. Now the next row is going to be just a row of regular knit stitch without a decrease, which I'll do here with you in just a second. But you're going to alternate between a decrease row and a regular knit stitch row until you complete the length you need for the toe. So the number of rows you are going to crochet is determined by the number of stitches you cast on in your foundation row. So remember when we counted the stitches on this side and on the other side of our fabric? As you cast on, if you kept count of your stitches, which would be the same thing that you counted down here. So for me, that ended up being 25 stitches. How that I don't really know, but that's what ended up happening once I adjusted these. I ended up with 25 stitches. So that's the number of stitches I had in my foundation row. If you divide that by half, which for me would have been what, 12 and a half, that's the number of loops I'm going to need to have on my hook after doing several rows of alternating knit stitch and knit stitch decreases. Because you can't have a half loop, pick one. Either go to 13 or go to 12. So I'm just going to go to 12, and as soon as I reach 12 loops on my hook,
I will cast on a bind off in the following row.
all right, so far we've crocheted that foundation row, row number 1. Now for row number 2, I'm just going to work regular knit stitch. So skip the first vertical stitch and knit stitch directly into this second one and into every other stitch of the row. So you knit the knits. That's it. So from here on out, just continue to alternate, and I'll show you what the fabric looks like once I get to my 12 loops on my hook after completing several rows, yeah? So here's a look at our fabric once we finish working several rows of decreases. Now, this last row is half of the number of stitches as the first row I cast on, so as my foundation row. So if you cast on 24 stitches, and you'd end up with 12 stitches up here, or whatever number that was. This always has to be half of what you cast on initially. Now once you've reached that number, you're going to work a bind off. Now since we're working a knit stitch, the bind off is quite simple. So you're going to cast on a knit stitch, and then you close as a single crochet. So yarn over and pull through 2. And you repeat this in every stitch of the row. So just cast on a knit stitch and close single crochet, knit stitch, single crochet. Once you've completed your bind off, your fabric is going to look like this. Now you're going to cast on and follow the same process you did for this section on this back side. So cast on the same number of stitches, work the same number of rows if you counted them, and if you didn't, just make sure that you end up on this last row with half of the stitches that you cast on in your foundation row. For this second one, since we are going to have to stitch this closed, leave a long tail end of yarn. You're going to use this for sewing. So leave a nice long bit like that. And then you begin your cast on. Make sure you do count your number of stitches so that both sides are even. It's going to make it a lot neater when you sew everything shut. If you miss it by a stitch or two, it's not a big deal, but it does make it a little bit cleaner. For those of you doing that, the slip stitch at the beginning of the row, just to keep everything from moving, remember that this is one stitch. It does have the 2 loops, but it counts as just one stitch. So you can see it right there. So don't count these as separate for your stitch count at the beginning of the row.
Once you've completed both panels of the toe, stitch along the right, the left, and the top side of the fabric to close off the entire toe section of your sock.
Okay, so to work the heel, so the fabric of your heel is going to look like this. Now to get this started, you're going to repeat all the steps you took for the toe. So just to create this exact same thing, make sure that you line up the beginning of your stitches on the same side so that you don't end up, with your toe over here and your heel this way, unless, that's the stylistic thing you want to do with it. But line everything up, match up where you put your, what are they called? These things, your stitch markers, and then work the same steps as you did for the toe with decrease every other row. Once you get to this ends part, we're going to start working on your increases. So instead of working a bind off, just go straight into your increases. The increases are worked in the same sequence as your decreases. So every other row gets an increase at the beginning of the row and at the end of the row. Now, in order to kind of make them match, so yes, it is going to continue to curl this way, but it won't matter. We have to, we're going to be stitching it and giving it the shape of the heel. So then the curl isn't going to matter. And then we're going to add the cuff. So for any of you worried about the curl, don't worry. We're going to take care of it here soon. All right. But so that you can see it. All right. So this is what your sides are going to look like. Now the increase you're going to use for this, let's get this all started here. Oh, I lost a stitch. No. Okay. All right, so the increase you're going to use is just a simple yarn over at the beginning of the row, and then you cast on into that next vertical stitch. And that's it. You work a knit stitch all the way across until you get to the last few stitches of your row. Oh, sorry, I've got paint. I've been painting. I can't get all the paint out. All right, so when you get to the end of the row, you're going to work into this last vertical stitch, and then here's our final stitch of the row. Let me see if I can get closer. So here's the final stitch of the row. So we're just going to cast on a knit stitch right here in the last vertical stitch. And then in this final stitch of the row, there we go. Let me see if I can hold it in a way that you can see. So it's got these two side legs right here, and then it's got one that's on the inside. So this one right here, we're going to cast this one on as a Tunisian simple stitch. So this is that side one. I'm just going to pinch these here. You're going to go in behind this leg, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then you're going to cast on into the stitch like you normally would have. So in between this side leg and the two at the end. You can't really see it here though. And this is a lot easier to do when you're not suspending your fabric up here. If you're holding it flat, it's a little easier to see your stitch. All right, so there we go, and we cast on. So you can kind of see it here. You've got your little side leg, and then you've got the stitch itself. And that's the increase for the end of the row. And I think they look fairly similar. I don't know, I've worked on trying to get increases to look the same on both sides, and I think I did it. But anyway, those are the increases you're going to use. And then once you're done with that, you're going to do just your regular bind off, which is that knit stitch single crochet that we did for the toe, and I guess for like almost everything here. So you work your bind off. When you're through, weave in all your ends, and then you're going to stitch along the sides. So you're going to fold your fabric over this way, line your things up, and then just stitch along the side on this one and on this one. So I'll get that done, and then we'll come back and work on the cuff. So here is our sock now that we finished the heel. And then all the tail ends have been woven in and everything. All right, so I'm going to begin the cuff either on this side or this side, it doesn't matter, but where the body of the sock meets the heel. So in this little transition section. So just pick one, and I'm going to chain 5. I did the same thing for the kids' socks. If you're going to make a slightly bigger size, or you're going to make one for men or whatever, and you want a slightly wider cuff, then, chain more, because the number of stitches in your chain is going to determine the width of the cuff this way. So I wouldn't go anything smaller than a 5. So even if you're making this for small children or newborn babies, I really wouldn't go smaller than a 5. So you can actually see all of your stitching. It gets really difficult to try to keep track of all the stitching if you go smaller than 5. But you can go wider if you want to. Now, if you want a full-size sock, the process is going to be a bit different. But for these nice little cuffs, it's really quite simple when you just chain 5. So let's start with that. So just go into whatever stitch you want to start at. Leave a nice tail end of yarn. And there we go. That counts as our first chain. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you work a foundation row. So 1, 2, 3, 4 into the last stitch. So we have 5 stitches on our hook, but we're going to want 6. So here's why. That last stitch is going to connect us to the actual sock itself. So we're going to insert our hook into the next available stitch. So we started here, we're going to go into this stitch right next to it and pull up a loop. And instead of doing the yarn over pull through 1, in order to maintain our stitch count of 5, we're going to yarn over and pull through 2. And then just yarn over, pull through 2 for the rest of the fabric. All right, so the stitch that we're using for the cuff, which I don't know what the name would be. But this is made up of it's a 2-row repeat. So for the first one, here, let me move that so you can see. We're going to stitch, we're in between the second and third vertical posts. So skip this section right here. We're going to go right in between these 2 posts. And I say the post because it's between, so the vertical stitch is made up of 2 legs. So if we're going to go between both of the legs like that, I call it the post. So I can't separate that enough so you can see, but we're going to go into the chain space right between the 2 vertical stitches, yarn over and pull up a loop. And you're going to do this here in the next one. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. So we see we got 4 loops, 5 loops, and then loop number 6, which goes into the fabric itself. So into this next stitch, and then yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until we get to the end. All right, so now for this second row, we're going to start between the first and second vertical stitch, and we're going to go through the back. So you insert your hook from back to front, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And we go into the next one. Oh, I didn't get all of the thread. And then here, so it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So see, you're going to be left with this one right here, and we're alternating. So remember, in this first row, we skipped that first chain space between the first and second vertical stitch and cast into the last one. In this one, we went right into that chain space between the first and second vertical stitch. So we're going to skip this last one and go into this next stitch right here. So as you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 loops on our hook. Loop number 6 is going to be this one, and this one you just cast it on by inserting your hook in the front. So that one's like that. And then just yarn over, pull through 2. And there we go. So we'll do these one more time because I think it's a little easier for you to see the stitching now that I've got a bit of a foundation for this stitch going. So let's go into the row 1 repeat. So we're going to skip this first chain space right here, and we're going to go into the second one. So we're going to go through the front, sorry. So it's from the front to the back, and pull up a loop. And then in the next chain space, so we got 4, 5, and then into the next stitch, so 6, and then return pass. There we go. And then we go into our next row, which is a row 2 repeat. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog running around. She's going a little crazy. All right, so we're going to go through the back between the first and second vertical stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop. And then in the next one and the next one, we got 4, 5 loops, skip this last one and go right into the fabric of the sock. Oh, I guess my dog ran out of zoomies. All right, and there we go. All right, so you're going to continue the same sequence all the way around this top part of the fabric. Now, when you get to these corners, because we didn't start right at that corner, you're going to see a whole bunch of little stitches. So this one's a little cleaner to see it, but crochet into each of these. Even if it doesn't look exactly like a stitch, like this one right here or here, crochet into each of these. So I think it might be more visible here on, yeah. So crochet one into here, one into here, one into here. So you won't be able to tell. As you can see, it still lays flat. It doesn't get any wavy or anything. But these extra stitches are going to make it so that the cuff has a little bit more stretch, because the stretch is here along the top of the cuff, not along the bottom. So as you're casting on into the fabric of the sock, you're not going to have any stretch down there. So these extra stitches are going to make it so that you can actually, stretch the cuff of the sock and fit your foot in. Otherwise, you would have gone through all this work for nothing because you won't get your foot past the cuff. So, So once you complete the round, your fabric, or I guess your sock at this point, is going to look like this. So it doesn't matter which of the two rows you ended up on, whether it was crocheting in towards the inside of the fabric or up towards the outside. It doesn't matter which one you ended up with. The bind off is going to be the same. And for this one, we're going to use the post. So we're going to insert our hook behind both of the legs of the vertical stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And then you just single crochet. You do this for all the posts. So all the way down. And what this particular what's it called, bind off is going to give you is this little edge right here, which you can then manipulate when you go to stitch this up to either pop up so that it looks like one of these stitches, or you can tuck it in and make it look like this flat side. And that way, whichever stitch you ended up on, you can continue the sequence and make it look seamless. So once you get to the bottom, I'm just going to crochet this last slip stitch. It's going to be right down here, so where I ended the previous row. And this is just a slip stitch. And then chain one. Leave yourself a little bit of a tail so you can use this to stitch the this side closed and to weave in ends. All right, so to stitch it, you have a couple of options as to where you can stitch. So we've got this row of stitches here along the top, but there's also a row of stitches here along the back. So depending on where you ended up in your sequence, you can move this around to create that seamless look, and then just go through and stitch. So I'm just going to use these back stitches to close this cuff. Let's go along here. And then all you do is just weave in your ends and you're all set.
Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. If you'd like to check out the written pattern for this or any of my other projects, you can stop by my online store. The link is in the description box below.
Two narrow ends. So keeping, I can't speak, keeping the honey stitch, oh my God,